Joseph, known in business circles as one of the sharpest and most successful entrepreneurs, stood before the mirror, lost in thought. His once lively eyes were now clouded with weariness, and the face that had once radiated confidence and determination was now etched with deep lines of age. He had never given much thought to growing old. His concerns had always been about new deals, expanding his influence, and the relentless pursuit of success. But now, in the doctor's office, he was confronted with a harsh truth, a truth he couldn't ignore. Death was quietly but inexorably approaching. His gray hair, disheveled, fell across his forehead, adding to the air of abandonment that clung to him. The doctor, a seasoned professional who had seen Joseph through many tough moments in life, now wore an expression of deep concern. The diagnosis he was about to deliver was not one that could be sugar-coated. "Joseph," he began with a faint hesitation in his voice, "I have to be honest with you. Time is not on your side. Even with treatment, the chances of recovery are slim. Without it, you have only a few months left." A heavy silence settled over the room. Yet Joseph, rather than sinking into despair, simply listened calmly to the doctor's words. He had always known this moment would come, and he had prepared for it, as though his entire life had been leading him to this inevitable conclusion. "Doctor," he finally spoke, looking at his reflection as if addressing himself, "letting a few more months without purpose, that's worse than death. There's no point in fighting for time. Time has lost its meaning for me. The only thing that matters is finding someone who can manage everything I've built over the years." The doctor remained silent, listening intently. He knew that Joseph's words weren't just idle musings. This was a man who had dedicated his life to building an empire, and he would not allow his legacy to fade into obscurity or fall into the wrong hands. "You're infertile, Joseph," the doctor gently reminded him, aware of how much this fact had weighed on him over the years. "You have no children, and none of your relatives can claim your fortune. You need to focus on yourself, on your health." But Joseph merely shook his head. What was the point of treatment? To buy a few more months spent in idle contemplation? He knew he couldn't dedicate the remainder of his life to preserving his body, when there was still a chance to make a difference in the world. Yes, he had no biological heirs, but that didn't mean his legacy couldn't live on. "I need to find someone who understands kindness," he mused aloud, almost forgetting the doctor's presence. "Someone who won't see my wealth as just a means to enrich themselves. Maybe if I disguise myself as a beggar, I can find such a person, someone who cares about more than just money." His decision had been the result of long and painful reflection. Joseph knew that his health was rapidly declining, but something far deeper than the fear of death gnawed at him. The thought of leaving this world without leaving behind even the smallest trace of his legacy haunted him more than any physical ailment. He understood that his illness was shortening his time, but within him burned a different flame, a desire to ensure that his name and work would continue after he was gone. The doctor, deeply concerned for his old friend, kept trying to persuade him. "Joseph, you need to think about your health. Without it, there will be no legacy. You have to give yourself a chance to live," he urged, sincerely worried. But Joseph shook his head with quiet, unyielding resolve. He understood that health had lost its former value for him. What was the point of life if it lacked purpose? "What is the legacy if there's no one to pass it on to?" he replied, straightening up as if challenging both fate and illness. I need to find someone who truly understands what lies behind everything I've created. Not just the money, but the very essence of what I've lived for. Only then will my legacy matter. He had made his decision, one that seemed inevitable. It was better to risk his health in pursuit of this goal than to live a few more years in empty vanity. Everything became crystal clear. He had to find a worthy successor, someone who could carry on his work and pass his values into the future. With this thought, Joseph left the doctor's office, heading toward his vast mansion, which now felt empty and cold, devoid of soul, just as he felt within himself. In the silence of his luxurious apartment, Joseph began preparing for what felt like his most unusual and perhaps final adventure. He donned dirty, torn clothes that would have once filled him with disdain, but now symbolized his determination. As he looked into the mirror, at the reflection of a man who barely resembled the once majestic and self-assured figure, he quietly muttered, "If this is to be my last act, let it be meaningful." With that thought, he ventured out into the streets of the city, immersing himself in a world to which he had never belonged. Life under the guise of a pauper soon became not only a test of his will but a complex game with his own past. He wandered through the streets, trying to disappear into the crowd, becoming invisible to those who hurried by, lost in their familiar routines. With each passing day, he felt more acutely how invisible he had become among these people. They walked past, unaware of the man who had once ruled a business empire, as if he were nothing more than part of the city's scenery. At some point, Joseph realized that his search was becoming not only a physical challenge, but also a test of his own faith in humanity. Will anyone see beyond the visible to the true value? He wondered, glancing at the passers-by, lost in their own worlds, oblivious to the fact that there could be someone in the city who needed their help. Joseph watched the flow of people, trying to find at least one spark of compassion, but he encountered only indifference and apathy. The nights were especially hard. The cold seeped into his bones, the loneliness weighed on him, and his illness grew more debilitating. Joseph felt his body failing him, but he continued to seek shelter in the forgotten corners of the city, hoping that there, in the shadows, he might meet someone capable of seeing more than just an old beggar. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. With each passing day, his hope waned, but he refused to give up. He was no stranger to challenges, even if now they were of a different kind. The city seemed to breathe coldness and indifference, and Joseph increasingly felt his confidence fading, unsure if his plan would ever succeed. He began to doubt whether he could find someone who would appreciate his life's work and carry on his legacy. But fate had an unexpected trial in store for him. One dark night, when a storm descended upon the city, everything changed. A torrential downpour flooded the streets, mixing with his exhaustion and pain. Soaked to the skin, he desperately tried to find shelter. The cold gnawed at his bones, and his body weakened further. Joseph, feeling the chill and rain penetrating to his very core, struggled to move under a canopy, vainly attempting to shield himself from the storm's fury. The wind lashed against his face, and the rain seemed to pierce his skin, reminding him of how vulnerable he had become. The night sky was torn by lightning, the flashes illuminating the deserted streets. Only the occasional rumble of thunder and the hiss of water running down the stones disturbed the eerie silence. It was then, in this grim emptiness, that his attention was drawn to a group of young men. They walked with quick, confident strides, laughing and shouting to each other. Their voices echoed off the walls, sounding especially harsh against the backdrop of the storm. Something about their energy unsettled Joseph, and a growing sense of dread crept over him as their laughter turned into sinister giggles. He knew he couldn't defend himself. His body, already weakened and worn by illness, would not survive a confrontation. The young men, dressed in heavy jackets and hats as if immune to the storm, formed a semicircle around him. The damp air thickened, and the tension became almost palpable. One of the boys, with a particularly dark expression, stepped closer and, with a mocking smile, taunted, "Hey, old man, what are you doing out here alone on a night like this? Cold, huh? Or maybe you're just shaking with fear." The words, dripping with sarcasm, drew laughter from his friends. Joseph, trying to remain calm even as anxiety gripped him inside, responded quietly, "I'm just trying to survive, like any of you." But this reply, which he had hoped would be a shield, only fueled their hostility. The boys looked at him with disdain, as if he were nothing more than an amusing plaything. One of them, unable to contain himself, pushed him, and with that first shove, more brutal blows followed. Their laughter, mingling with the storm's roar, rang in his ears as each strike brought new waves of pain. His frail health offered no chance of resistance. Joseph tried to shield himself, to defend against the onslaught, but his efforts were in vain. His arms weakened, his legs gave way, and he collapsed to the ground. Each hit, every impact with the wet asphalt, sent sharp jolts of pain through his body. His thoughts became jumbled, and in his despair, he wondered, "Why is the world so cruel? Why, even in the final days of my life, can I not find peace?" Darkness began to close in, and Joseph's consciousness started to slip away. The voices of the young men grew distant, as though he was slowly sinking into an abyss. Each breath became a struggle, and the cold rain mixed with blood running down his face. The world around him seemed to weep with him. And then, amid the chaos, thunder, and relentless blows, a new, strong voice pierced the night. "Stop it! Leave my dad alone!" The unexpected shout caught through the darkness like lightning. The attackers froze, as if the sharp words had drained them of their power. A boy, appearing as if from nowhere, stood with a determination and resolve that could make even grown men retreat. The young men, visibly shaken, exchanged uneasy glances, muttering among themselves. After a moment, as though broken by the boy's unwavering confidence, they slunk away into the darkness, disappearing into the storm. Joseph, still dazed and overwhelmed, could hardly believe what had just happened. He felt weak, and the world blurred before his eyes. Questions, mixed with pain and shock, swirled in his mind, but one thought confused him more than any other. The boy, who had just saved him, had called him Dad. It sounded so unexpected, so impossible. "Thank you, but why did you call me Dad?" he mumbled, still in disbelief. "I don't have any children. I can't have children." His voice was faint, full of disbelief and confusion, barely audible against the storm's raging backdrop. The boy stood beside him, offering his hand. Every movement was torture for his weakened body, but Joseph kept walking, clinging to the boy's words. There was something in them that stirred hope within him, despite all the skepticism and doubt that tormented his mind. The boy, with a steady and determined gaze and eyes full of concern, said, "I called you Dad because you are my father. My name is Aiden, and my mother told me about you." Come home with me, and I'll explain everything. Joseph staggered, barely believing what he had heard. With each step beside Aiden, he felt his body protest against continuing this strange journey. The pain from the beatings merged with the pain of his inner turmoil. Yet, despite his exhaustion, he sensed that the boy was more than just a physical support. He was a beacon in the darkness in which Joseph had wandered for so long. I'm so tired and confused, but I need to understand what's happening. Who is this boy? I can't have children. Could this be some kind of trick? But why would he help me if he meant me harm? And why does he look so much like me? The thoughts swirled in his mind like a restless wind, one he couldn't control. Aiden walked ahead, confidently leading Joseph through the wet streets, lit only by the occasional dim light, as if he knew the path by heart. The rain kept drumming on the asphalt, washing away their footsteps and muffling the surrounding sounds. You probably have a lot of questions, the boy began, glancing at Joseph with a look full of respect and expectation. I know it's confusing, but my mom always said you were important. That one day I would find you. Aiden's words echoed in Joseph's mind, filling him with a mix of astonishment and bewilderment. He tried to grasp what he had just heard, but his mind stubbornly refused to accept the information. How can this be true? I was never able to have children, he thought, feeling sparks of hope flickering within him, battling with disbelief. Everything happening seemed too strange, too unexpected to be real. Yet Aiden's presence was more than just another puzzle. It reminded Joseph that even in the darkest, most desperate hours, fate could turn in ways he never imagined. They walked until they stopped in front of a small, modest house, which Joseph realized was their destination. The door to the house opened, and from the warm, cozy interior, a woman emerged, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Her face initially showed the weariness of a long day, but as soon as she saw Joseph, recognition flashed in her eyes. Her expression instantly changed, shock, surprise, and almost fear at the unexpected encounter. Oh, Joseph, it can't be, she whispered, her voice trembling. What happened to you? And what are these clothes? She looked him over with disbelief, her eyes full of astonishment and concern. Before her stood a man she likely never expected to see again. And Joseph, equally shocked, realized that the woman standing before him was Lillian, his former love, with whom he had parted ways many years ago. Lillian looked different. Time had left its marks on her face, but it was undoubtedly her. Her eyes held a mixture of recognition and uncertainty, and in those eyes was reflected a whole range of emotions that Joseph could barely comprehend. Lillian, I didn't know you lived here, he began, feeling his voice tremble with inner tension. I ran into some trouble with some guys a few blocks away. Aiden helped me. But I'm very confused and overwhelmed by all of this. He fell silent, feeling his own confusion grow under Lillian's piercing gaze. An inner discomfort gripped him, as if he had intruded on a world, a reality that no longer belonged to him. Lillian shook her head, as if struggling to believe what was happening. I never thought I'd see you again, she said quietly, her voice barely shaking with emotion. And now here you are, like this, after all these years. Silence hung in the air, thick with tension. Joseph stood on the threshold of a life he once knew, but which now seemed foreign. He said he's my son, but you know I'm infertile. Joseph spoke as if trying to untangle the web of his thoughts, his voice filled with pain and confusion. Like a man drowning in the waves of the past, he desperately tried to grasp onto the familiar reality where this boy couldn't be his son. "I'm sorry, Lillian, but this boy can't be mine." His words were firm, but the inner turmoil was clear. Lillian sighed, running a hand through her hair. She slowly shifted her gaze from Aiden to Joseph, as if trying to convey something she had come to understand long ago. "Joseph, Aiden is your son. I'm certain of it. Maybe there was a mistake with your diagnosis or something else, but I know he's yours." Her words were spoken with such conviction that Joseph was nearly breathless with surprise. Her certainty struck him like a bolt from the blue. "How is this possible?" he thought. "I went through several tests in different labs, consulted numerous doctors. Aiden can't be my son, though he is a wonderful boy. I wish it were true, but it's impossible." He said it aloud, but despite his words, he felt a tiny spark of hope ignite deep within his heart. Fragile, barely noticeable, but it was there. Lillian watched him closely, her eyes catching the slightest changes in his expression. She could see how his inner world began to waver, how his mind struggled with the new information. "You are Aiden's father, Joseph," she said softly but insistently. "I would never make that up. I had to raise him alone, but he always knew who you were. When we broke up, I left town. It was a hard time for both of us. And when I found out I was pregnant," her voice trembled, "you were already gone, and I couldn't find you. I thought I'd never see you again." Lillian spoke with such sincerity that each word felt like a heavy stone slowly sinking into Joseph's soul. He could feel the distance between them, not just of time, but of unspoken words, pain, and regrets. He realized how blind he had been to her attempts to reach him back then. She continued, her face reflecting the pain she had hidden for so long. "I wanted to find you, Joseph. I should have, but—" Her face clouded over, as if the memories of the past brought back painful feelings. "I thought it would be better this way. You were gone, and then I heard about your infertility. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me, that you'd think it was all a lie." Struck by her revelation, Joseph fell silent. Lillian stood before him, embodying all the mistakes and hard decisions they both had made in the past. Her face seemed to hold the memory of those years full of anxiety and loneliness, and now Joseph couldn't help but wonder how many wrong choices he had made, living with the belief that he had no heirs, that his life was leading to nowhere. The truth always finds a way out, Joseph thought, realizing that he now stood before a second chance. How often does life offer such a chance? It stood before him now, in the form of this boy, his son, whose existence he had never suspected, and Lillian, the woman with whom he shared so many joyful and bitter memories, now stood before him, embodying the unbearable separations that had torn their lives apart. Aiden silently watched them, his eyes following every word as if he were a part of a story he hadn't fully known until now. He was patient, understanding that his parents needed to resolve their differences. Yet every second of this silence weighed heavily on Joseph, and finally he took a deep breath and met the boy's gaze. "I need time to process all this," Joseph said quietly but seriously. "But I want to understand what happened." Lillian nodded, her face finally softening. She allowed herself a hesitant smile, though her eyes still reflected a hint of anxiety. She couldn't fully relax, not knowing if Joseph would accept this new truth about his life. In her presence, he felt as though he was on unfamiliar ground. Everything was so familiar, yet at the same time, completely new and unclear. Lillian was still overwhelmed by this sudden reunion. Joseph, whom she had long written off, now stood before her, wounded, exhausted, but alive. The revelation that Aidan was his son hung in the air, filling the space with tension. With each breath Joseph took, it became clear that this information was slowly shattering his previous certainty about his life. "You should have told me earlier," he suddenly burst out, unable to contain his emotions. His voice rose an octave, and all the pain and disappointment that had accumulated over the years came rushing out. "How could you hide this from me?" His words cut through the air like lightning. Lillian stood before Joseph, her voice trembling with emotion and exhaustion. She was on the edge, tears held back, adding a sharpness to her words as if every sentence had been suppressed for years. "I could have helped. I could have been there for him," she repeated insistently, hoping her words would reach Joseph's heart. But he didn't seem to hear her. His face was a mask of dull disappointment and hurt that enveloped him like a thick cloud. "You stole a part of my life from me," he said, barely controlling his anger. Each word was filled with pain. "How could you keep something like this from me? I feel betrayed. You didn't even give me a chance to know my son. Do you think it was easy for me?" Her voice quivered, and now her eyes shone with unshed tears. "You disappeared, Joseph. I was left alone, scared and confused. How would you have reacted if you had known? What would you have done? You know how hard it was for me to raise Aiden on my own, always fearing that you would reject him if you found out." Her voice was unyielding, but it carried a deep vulnerability. Joseph was stunned by her words, but he couldn't allow himself to show weakness. His heart ached with the sharp realization that all those moments, Aiden's first steps, his first words, his first laughter, had been stolen from him. Now he stood before the woman who had once been so close to him, but now felt like a stranger, despite her desperate explanations. "You took away my chance to know that I became a father," he shouted, glaring at her. "You made the decision for both of us. And now I'm here, completely lost, not knowing what to think or how to deal with this." Each of his words hit Lillian like a whip. She could feel how the choices she once thought were right now turned against her, unraveling everything she had tried to protect. The realization weighed on her like a dark cloud, threatening to unleash a storm of regrets. "I did the best I could, Joseph," she said, her voice quieter but still firm. "I acted with the information I had. I didn't want to keep Aiden from you. But I was scared, scared that you'd reject him. And I couldn't bear that." Her confession was sincere, but it couldn't silence the deep pain in Joseph's heart. He was on the verge of breaking, his mind unable to grasp the full depth of this betrayal, even though he could hear the truth and regret in her words. Suddenly, the silence in the room was broken. Aiden, who had been quietly observing his parents' argument, felt his body begin to fail. He took a deep breath, trying to get their attention. "Mom, Dad, I don't feel well," he murmured before collapsing to the floor. Those words, spoken in a weakening voice, cut through the argument with chilling clarity. Lillian and Joseph froze in shock before rushing toward their son at the same time. Joseph, forgetting his anger, scooped the boy into his arms, feeling panic take over his mind. "We have to get him to a hospital." Lillian, kneeling beside their son, couldn't hide the desperation in her voice. Her hands trembled as she tried to wake Aiden. Joseph didn't waste any time. Lifting the boy, he hurried toward the door. The drive to the hospital became a race against time. Every traffic light, every second on the road felt like an eternity. Both parents were consumed by a single goal: saving their son. Despite the tension inside him, Joseph tried to stay calm, cradling Aiden in his arms, while Lillian drove the car with the urgency of someone whose life depended on it. "Please, God, let him be okay," Joseph prayed silently, his heart pounding in his chest, each breath a struggle. His thoughts raced between fear and hope, like a torn sail in the wind. When they finally arrived at the hospital, all their internal conflict faded into the background. The only thing that mattered now was Aiden's condition. They rushed inside, and the doctors quickly took the boy into the emergency room. Time in the hospital crawled by painfully slow. Seconds turned into minutes, minutes into hours. Lillian and Joseph, sitting in the waiting room, couldn't take their eyes off the door behind which their son lay. Joseph sat next to Lillian, lost in the whirlwind of his thoughts. His mind raced between reality and his deepest fears, trying to grasp everything that had happened. He's just a child, and yet he's already fighting for his life, Joseph thought, feeling the crushing weight of the situation pressing on his heart. Everything they once thought was important suddenly seemed trivial, giving way to a singular focus: saving Aiden. Beside him, Lillian looked as though she was on the brink of collapse. Her hands twisted nervously, her fingers clenching into tight fists, revealing her inner turmoil. Her eyes were glued to the door where their son lay behind, filled with a desperate hope. She was fighting to keep her emotions in check, but her face had a pale, worn look, like someone terrified of losing everything. At last, the door to the emergency room creaked open, and a doctor appeared in the doorway. His expression was serious, and with each step he took toward Joseph and Lillian, the tension grew almost unbearable. They'd both shot to their feet, searching his face for any sign of good news, but their hopes hung in the balance of his silence. Lillian was the first to break it. "Doctor, how is Aiden?" she asked, her voice trembling, each word barely making it past her fear. The doctor hesitated, carefully choosing his words, as though each one held immense weight. "Aiden has a rare genetic condition," he said with heavy gravity. "Right now, he's in a critical state, and to survive, he urgently needs a transplant." The words hit them like a cold wind. Lillian staggered, her breathing quickened, and her eyes widened in horror. Joseph, despite the crushing news, immediately realized the gravity of the situation. He clenched his jaw, bracing himself for the battle ahead. "What can we do?" "He has to survive," Joseph said with determination, refusing to show any weakness. Lillian stood next to him, gripping Joseph's hand as though it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Her voice, trembling and broken, fought through her tears. "We have to do something. He can't die," she pleaded, her desperation clinging to the last thread of hope. The doctor shook his head, his face solemn. "We are searching for a donor, but unfortunately, finding a match is difficult. It's a rare condition, and the chances of success are slim." The doctor's words hit like a blow to the heart. Joseph felt the worry and fear swell inside him, but along with it came a sense of responsibility. Every word the doctor spoke underscored how dire the situation was. and that they were running out of time. Is there a chance I could be a match? Joseph suddenly asked, the thought blazing in his mind as a last-ditch lifeline. He desperately searched for any solution that might save his son. Lillian looked at him in surprise, and for a brief moment, hope flickered in her eyes. The doctor paused thoughtfully, then nodded. We will conduct tests to check. The doctor's words rang with urgency, and the seriousness of the moment settled over them like a heavy cloud. The room seemed to stand still, filled with the oppressive silence of unspoken fears, unanswered questions, and endless waiting. Time crawled painfully by, each minute stretching into an eternity. Joseph glanced at Lillian. In his eyes, there was a resolve that had been hidden beneath his anxiety until now. We need help, he said firmly, sending a ray of hope into the chaos around them. We have to do everything to get Aiden what he needs. He can't fight this alone. Lillian nodded, barely holding back her tears. Her eyes were filled with pain, but she held onto Joseph's hand like it was the only thing keeping her together under the crushing weight of fear. We have to believe it's going to be okay, she whispered, her voice quiet but resolute. Despite the fear, Lillian knew they had to stand united. They had to face this together. The doctor left, leaving Joseph and Lillian in the heavy silence, reminding them that life could change in an instant and that Aiden's fight was only beginning. Some time later, Joseph's and Lillian's footsteps echoed in the hospital corridors as they headed to the lab to give their samples for testing. Time seemed to drag, every movement of doctors and nurses around them blurred, as if they were in a tense, otherworldly place. The lab buzzed with activity. Doctors and technicians moved quickly between machines and tables, handling samples and results. But for Joseph and Lillian, it all felt like background noise to the anxiety that burned inside them. Joseph sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his back stiffened, as if bracing against the fear. His eyes were fixed on the doctor, who, with a stony expression, reviewed the test results. The air in the room was thick with tension, and every tick of the clock seemed to add to its weight. Joseph's heart raced, feeling like it knew something monumental was about to happen. Finally, the doctor, having gathered all the necessary information, approached them. His face reflected a range of emotions, from seriousness to something resembling sympathy. Mr. Joseph, Ms. Lillian, he began carefully, his tone measured. I have the test results. Both Lillian and Joseph tensed, bracing for what they were about to hear. Every nerve in their bodies stretched tight in anticipation of the blow. The doctor paused, as if gathering his thoughts, then continued. The DNA test confirms, Mr. Joseph, you are indeed Aiden's biological father. Those words hit like a thunderclap. Joseph, who had doubted and denied it for so long, suddenly felt something deep within him shift. A flood of emotions washed over him like a tidal wave. His heart was torn between surprise, joy, and confusion. Oh my God, how is this possible? He muttered, hardly believing his own ears. How could I be worthy of such a blessing? His voice shook with emotion. He never imagined that this moment, accepting his role as Aiden's father, would be so overwhelmingly complex and yet so profoundly important. But before he could fully process it, the doctor's tone darkened. Unfortunately, the tests show that you are not a viable donor, Mr. Joseph. Your health is too fragile, and attempting the procedure could be fatal for you. Moreover, the risk isn't worth it. The chances of success are too slim. The words pierced Joseph like a dagger. He felt the ground beneath him slip away for a moment. The doctor had referred to his heart, the very heart that had been burdened by years of stress and loss. It turned out that his recent hardships had only worsened his condition, and now any operation could prove deadly. Lillian gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, nearly collapsing under the weight of the revelation. "What does this mean for Aiden?" she asked, her voice thick with terror. The doctor sighed, his face grave and serious. "It means we need to find another donor as quickly as possible. Time is not on our side, and every hour counts." Lillian's head spun with all the information. She clung to Joseph's hand as if her strength was about to give out. The doctor looked at them both with unspoken compassion. "As for you, Mr. Joseph, I strongly advise you to begin treatment as soon as possible. Your condition cannot wait." At that moment, the door to the room swung open, and a nurse entered, her face pale with worry. "Doctor, Aiden's condition is worsening. We need immediate intervention." The doctor frowned, nodded, and quickly moved toward the door. Before leaving, he cast a meaningful glance at Joseph and Lillian, as if to say, "I'll do everything I can, but we're running out of time. Please save my son," Lillian cried, her voice pierced with tears and desperation. Joseph stood up, intending to follow the doctor, but suddenly felt his body betray him. A wave of dizziness overtook him, and he had to lean against the wall to avoid collapsing. Lillian rushed to his side, her eyes wide with fear. "Joseph, you have to be careful. You can't risk yourself. We can't lose both of you." Her voice trembled, her face a mix of fear and helplessness. Joseph gathered his strength, trying to reassure her. "I can't think about myself right now, Lillian. Aiden needs us. We have to do everything we can for him," he replied, his voice firm, but beneath it, exhaustion seeped through as if the battle within him had already begun. They watched helplessly as the doctor and nurse hurried back to Aiden, trying to save him. Lillian looked as though her strength was on the verge of fading. Her hand shook, and her eyes searched for comfort in the emptiness. But suddenly, her expression changed. The internal struggle she had been fighting found its resolution. Her eyes filled with determination, though tears threatened to spill over. "Joseph," her voice trembled but carried courage. "There's something you need to know. Something important. I should have told you long ago." Joseph stared at Lillian, his gaze filled with a mix of surprise and concern. She stood before him, ashamed and afraid, trying to summon all her courage to say something vital. Desperation was written all over her face, as if she had been carrying this burden for far too long. "What is that, Lillian?" His voice shook with tension. "What could be so important right now when every second counts?" Lillian took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts and mustering the courage to say what she had long kept hidden. She averted her eyes for a moment, and then, barely holding back tears, she began to speak. "Aiden has a twin sister. Her name is Aya. I gave her up for adoption when they were born." The words, spoken so softly and hesitantly, hung in the air with devastating force. Joseph felt as if the room around him spun, as though the world had suddenly lost its balance. He staggered, as if hit by the shock of the revelation. "A twin sister?" His voice faltered, each word coming out slowly, as if his mind couldn't grasp what was happening. "Why? How is that possible?" Lillian, Her face, contorted with pain, took a step back. Her voice broke, and she gasped for air as she recounted the events that had become an unbearable weight on her soul. I couldn't raise both children alone. We were in poverty. I didn't have the means to feed them both. I was so desperate. I didn't know how to find you, how to ask for help. I did everything I could, but two of them, I just couldn't manage it. Aiden was already struggling, and she was starving. I thought I was making the right choice, giving her a chance at a better life. Each word Lillian spoke came with searing pain, as if the confession itself burned her from within. Joseph, stunned by this revelation, could barely breathe. His mind was flooded with questions, but he found no answers. He couldn't process everything he had just heard. She, she could be the only chance for Aiden, Lillian added, her voice shaking with the unbearable thought that her decision might have doomed their son. Joseph clenched his fists, his mind racing to consider the new possibilities. He looked at Lillian, his face a mixture of shock, anger, and hope. She was telling the truth, and though he was overwhelmed with emotions, his mind was slowly beginning to piece together the situation. A twin sister, he muttered, suddenly realizing that this might be their only hope. She could be the perfect donor. A moment of sudden clarity struck Joseph like a bolt of lightning, illuminating the darkness of his doubts. Just then, the piercing sound of an alarm came from Aiden's room. Both of them turned sharply toward the source, where doctors and nurses were rushing in. Everything happened in an instant, but for Joseph and Lillian, time stood still. Their fear for each other and for Aiden became palpable, like a thick fog enveloping them. Aiden's condition was deteriorating before their eyes, and now they had new information that could change everything. Time was running out, and every moment mattered. Joseph, suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation, pulled himself together. His business instincts, sharpened by years of experience, took over, pushing aside the panic. Despite the trembling in his hands and the confusion in his mind, he pulled out his phone and quickly started dialing numbers. His voice, usually calm and confident, was now filled with desperate urgency. I need every possible resource, he ordered into the phone. Find the adoption agency. Search all the records. Track down anyone who had any involvement. Do whatever it takes, immediately. His words echoed through the hospital corridor, amplifying the tension. Joseph paced back and forth, clutching the phone tightly, gesturing wildly as he gave directions. Time was against them, and every minute felt like an eternity. Lillian stood by the door to Aiden's room, her heart pounding with unbearable pain, her gaze darting between her son, who was fighting for his life, and Joseph, who was battling time, trying to find their only chance. Time moved so slowly it felt as if the world had stalled in endless suffering. Meanwhile, the search for Aya had ignited like wildfire. Joseph had mobilized his lawyers, private investigators, and every possible contact, including government agencies. People were combing through old archives, searching for traces and adoption records, questioning former staff, hoping to pull any thread from the past that could lead them to Aya. Any updates? Joseph asked one of his assistants over the phone when they called him again, his voice filled with tension. Nothing yet, sir, came the reply. The records are incomplete. We're trying to track down former employees. Joseph gritted his teeth. It was the answer he feared but refused to accept. Time crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Joseph paced the hospital corridor, never taking his eyes off the door to Aiden's room. Every sound from the monitors inside was a relentless reminder of how his son's life was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. Lillian sat by Aiden's bedside, holding his small hand. Her lips moved in a barely audible whisper as she tried to comfort her son, even though she knew his consciousness was fading, leaving her words unanswered. In her voice, there were notes of pain and despair, and the tears she had been holding back threatened to flow. "What if we don't find her in time, Joseph?" she whispered, her voice filled with fear. "What if we don't find a matching donor?" Joseph clenched his fists, his face set in determination. Beneath his exhaustion, there was a hard, unyielding resolve. He couldn't afford to think about failure. "We can't think like that, Lillian," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "We will find her. We have to find her." The night continued to engulf the hospital with a dark, ominous blanket. Doctors and nurses rushed back and forth, their every attempt to stabilize Aiden growing increasingly desperate. The machines beeped with rising frequency, and Aiden's vital signs were visibly declining. Medications and equipment were updated, but their effects lasted only moments before everything worsened again. Joseph and Lillian sat together, their hands intertwined in silent vigil. They didn't speak, but their souls were united by one goal: to save Aiden. The air in the room was so thick with tension that it felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. And then the phone rang, shattering the silence. The sound was so unexpected that they both flinched. Joseph grabbed the phone quickly, his heart suspended between hope and fear. "Hello?" His voice was filled with tension. He couldn't wait a second longer. "Sir, we found a lead regarding Aya, but the situation is complicated." The voice on the other end sounded as though the weight of the moment was palpable even to them. Joseph felt his throat tighten, his voice almost breaking. "Speak faster, for God's sake," he whispered, his entire body tensing to the brink. The silence that followed was deafening. Time seemed to stop for both Joseph and Lillian. They exchanged anxious glances, holding their breath for what would come next. Joseph's heart pounded at his chest like a hammer, the blood rushing in his ears. "The woman who adopted her," the investigator's voice grew quieter, as if afraid to deliver the blow. "They moved abroad years ago. We're trying to track down which country they're in, but the records are quite tangled." Joseph felt the ground beneath him give way. The news that Aya might be overseas, possibly on the other side of the world, shattered his hopes like fragile glass. He sat silently, hearing Lillian's heart beat beside him, feeling her hand grip his tighter, as if she clung to that thin thread between hope and despair. After ending the call, Joseph turned to Lillian, his face more strained than ever. "I might be outside the country," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion and concealed desperation. "We don't know exactly where yet, but I've mobilized the whole team. They're looking for her as we speak." "Oh, no, no," Lillian whispered, her voice breaking into a sob. Tears that she had fought so hard to hold back finally spilled over. "She can't be so far away, not now." Joseph squeezed her hand even harder, feeling the rising panic within him that he struggled to suppress. "We won't give up," he said, trying to steady his voice. "I'll call in all my international contacts. We'll find her, even if I have to turn the world upside down." His words, filled with determination, echoed through the silence of the hospital room like the last hope they had left. Several more minutes passed. The hospital was again steeped in anxious waiting. Joseph sat rigid, the tension in his body reflected in every gesture, every glance he cast toward Aiden's room. Then again, the phone rang. This call felt sacred, final, something that could change everything. He grabbed the phone swiftly, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, but still clinging to hope. "Speak," he commanded, forgetting all formalities, just needing to hear the news. "Sir, we've located Aya." The investigator's voice was insistent. "She's in a hospital in Spain." A wave of relief washed over Joseph, but it was fleeting. His heart was immediately filled with a new dread as he realized Aya, their only hope, might be in danger. The call from Spain hit like a thunderclap in the already suffocating silence of the hospital room. With a trembling hand, Joseph put the phone on speaker so Lillian could hear. He felt his breath catch. Why was Aya, their one hope, in the hospital? Lillian, clutching the arm of the chair, asked in a strained voice. "What happened to her? Why is she in the hospital?" The investigator's voice faltered, as if struggling to find the right words. After a brief pause, he delivered the blow. "Sir, ma'am, I is also gravely ill. She has been diagnosed with the same genetic condition as your son." The words hit Joseph and Lillian like a heavy weight. For several seconds, there was only silence. The air in the room became thick and oppressive, each breath an agonizing effort. Lillian finally broke down. Her face twisted in pain, and she whispered, barely holding back her tears, "My children, both suffering, and I didn't even know." Joseph, feeling despair crack to his iron mask, suddenly stood. His mind raced, desperately searching for a solution, clinging to any possibility. He couldn't afford to lose either child. Clenching his jaw, he turned to the phone. "I need to speak to our doctors immediately," his voice filled with steely determination, leaving no room for discussion or objections. Within minutes, Joseph had arranged a video conference with the medical team in Spain. Lillian sat beside him, silently shedding tears, her eyes shining with unbearable pain. The laptop screen flickered on, and the tired faces of the Spanish doctors appeared, looking as worried as they were. The lead doctor spoke softly, but the gravity of the situation only deepened. "Aya's condition is critical," the doctor said, glancing down at his notes. "Like her brother, she urgently needs a transplant. Time is not on our side." Joseph, feeling his heart tighten with every word, still tried to grasp onto any shred of hope. "Doctor," he said, fighting the tremble in his voice, "is it possible? Could they donate to each other?" The doctor froze for a moment, clearly weighing the option. But then he shook his head, his expression filled with regret. "Unfortunately, both are too weak to be donors for one another. Their conditions are too unstable." Joseph felt the crushing weight of disappointment and despair engulf him, dark cloud threatening to blot out the last vestiges of hope. But even this could not make him surrender. He had always been a man who fought to the end, even when the odds were against him. His gaze fell on Dr. Aiden, who entered the room at that moment to assess the situation. "Doctor," Joseph addressed him, his voice filled with urgency he could no longer suppress. "Is there a chance I could donate an organ to one of them?" The doctor furrowed his brow, carefully considering the question. His expression was focused and serious, the look of a man who understood the complexity of the situation. Finally, he spoke, choosing his words carefully. Mr. Joseph, given that you're their biological father, there's a chance it could work, but he paused, as if reluctant to continue. With your recently discovered heart condition, it would be extremely risky. I fear you wouldn't survive the operation. These words hit Joseph with unbearable weight. He closed his eyes, trying to process what he had just heard. Lillian, her eyes wide with horror, grabbed his hand, her voice breaking into a desperate cry. No, Joseph. You can't risk your life like this. We'll find someone else. There's still time, you know so many people. Joseph gently placed his hand over hers, his gaze filled with tenderness, but behind it lay an unshakable resolve. If there's a chance to save even one of our children, he said quietly, I have to try. Every second that slipped away felt unbearably heavy. Time seemed to accelerate, throwing them into a whirlwind of impossible choices. How could they choose between their children? How could they make such a decision? But reality had already left no room for retreat. Lillian sobbed, clenching her fists, her soul torn apart by contradictions that defied logic. She looked at Joseph with eyes full of pain, her voice trembling with the final cry of despair. How can we choose, Joseph? How? Tears streamed down her cheeks, her face a mirror of the agony tearing out from within with no way to escape. Joseph closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He remained silent for a long time, lost in endless thoughts, as if searching for the strength to make the final, most decisive move. In his heart, fear and love battled, but he knew it was impossible to choose between his children. Without opening his eyes, he whispered, We can't choose, Lillian, but I'll do whatever it takes. I don't care about anything else but saving them. His voice was firm, though his heart was gripped with fear. When he opened his eyes, Joseph met the gaze of the doctors, who stood before him with tense anticipation. The determination on his face was clear. It was more than just intention. He had already made up his mind. I'll donate to both, he said calmly, but with such certainty that the silence in the room became even more palpable, broken only by the steady beeping of heart monitors. Dr. Ramirez, still on the computer screen, broke the silence. Mr. Joseph, I must be honest with you. You need to fully understand the risks. Your heart is in too weak a condition for this procedure. The odds. I don't need your statistics, doctor, Joseph interrupted firmly, raising his hand to signal he didn't want to hear more. I just need to know one thing. Is there a chance to save my children? Lillian, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand. Her face was wet with tears slowly streaming down her cheeks, and her voice, filled with pleading, broke. Joseph, please think about it. We can't lose you too. But there wasn't even a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Joseph's decision set the clock racing against time. Dr. Ramirez, understanding the seriousness of the situation, spoke with equal urgency. If you are truly willing to take this step, Miss Lillian, we must act immediately. I needs to be brought here as soon as possible. Every minute counts. Joseph nodded without hesitation, already diving into the logistics of it all. He started making calls, giving orders, organizing transport. But then Lillian, quietly but insistently, said, What about her adoptive mother? She needs to give her consent. Joseph's heart sank at the thought. A wave of worry washed over him. Would this woman understand the gravity of the situation? The Spanish doctors had already been trying to contact the adoptive mother, explaining the severity of the case. But the voice on the other end was full of anxiety. "I understand your concern," the doctor said, trying to persuade Mrs. White. "But this may be her only chance to survive." Mrs. White, frightened and confused, hesitated, her voice trembling with fear. "But the trip, it's so risky. What if something happens during the flight?" The words hung in the air, making Joseph feel the full weight of the moment. He could no longer stay silent. His voice, filled with raw emotion, broke through the fear. "Please, I know you don't know me, and you have no reason to trust me. But I beg you, give me the chance to save my daughter, my child. As a parent, I'm asking you." There was a long pause on the other end. It seemed to stretch endlessly. Lillian watched Joseph anxiously, silently praying for a miracle. Finally, Mrs. White's voice returned, but this time it was softer, with a willingness to relent. "All right, I agree to whatever is necessary to save my girl." Her words seemed to unlock time. From that moment on, everything became a whirlwind of feverish activity. The approval was secured, and the rescue operation began. Within hours, a medical plane equipped with all the necessary equipment to keep Aya stable during the flight was ready. The best specialists were mobilized, experts in transporting critically ill patients. Every moment became priceless. Every second brought them closer to hope. Joseph wasn't about to lose a single minute. "I'm flying on that plane," he declared firmly, rising from his hospital bed. His movements were confident, but Lillian grabbed his hand in alarm, her eyes wide with fear. "Joseph, you can barely stand." Lillian's voice trembled with concern. "How are you going to survive this flight?" Her words were filled with desperation, but Joseph remained resolute. He slowly turned to her, meeting her gaze, and softly but firmly said, "I can't send our daughter alone in her condition. I need to be there, Lillian." His words sounded like a final decree, not just to himself, but to all the doubts that might arise. Defying all medical advice, despite his own weakness, he stood up and, leaning on the chair, boarded the plane that was to take Aya. Time seemed to stretch, each moment of waiting filled with anxiety. The preparation for the flight dragged on, as if space and time themselves resisted this dangerous mission. But finally, Joseph saw the medical team bringing his daughter's stretcher onto the plane. His heart momentarily stopped when he saw Aya, a fragile, pale figure surrounded by a tangle of tubes and monitors lay before him. His daughter, the child he hadn't known existed just days ago. Tears welled up in his eyes. Joseph gazed at her, absorbing every feature of her face. "Aya," he whispered softly, saying her name as if it were something ancient and long familiar, though the name was new and strange to him. Despite all the medical equipment surrounding her, he suddenly saw something familiar in her features. The line of her nose reminded him of Lillian, the delicate curve of her cheek seemed to mirror her mother, and in the determined set of her chin, Joseph recognized himself. This wave of love and desire to protect her was so overwhelming that it took his breath away. During the flight, Joseph didn't take his eyes off his daughter. He watched as the doctors closely monitored her vital signs. Every beep of the heart monitors echoed in his head, like a painful reminder of her fragile state. But somewhere deep within this anxiety, hope flickered. Every breath Aya took, every heartbeat recorded was a sign she was still fighting. The hours of the flight dragged on painfully, each moment filled with unbearable anticipation and physical discomfort, but Joseph kept his eyes fixed on Aya, unable to look away. It felt as if every second of her life on the monitors was both agony and a blessing at the same time. "We're losing altitude," the pilot suddenly shouted. Joseph felt his heart clench with panic. "No, not now. Please, God, not now," he whispered, gripping the armrest of his seat. The plane made a rough landing, hitting the ground at a small airport with a loud crash. Ignoring his own pain and weakness, Joseph immediately got up to help the medical team stabilize Aya. "Hold on, we're almost there," he whispered, squeezing the hand of the child who was almost a stranger to him, yet felt closer than anyone else at this moment. After hours of waiting and repairs to the plane, they were finally back in the air. Joseph was exhausted, his body aching with fatigue, but his resolve remained unshaken. When they finally reached their destination, Joseph, despite his exhaustion, felt only one thing: boundless relief and hope. Aya was quickly transferred to the hospital, where her brother Aiden was already waiting. The surgical center glowed like a beacon in the night. Joseph looked at his children, one lying on one side, the other on the opposite side. A tremor ran through his body, but inside, a firm thought echoed. "We're all here. Now let's fight together," he quietly said, trying to infuse his tiny, defenseless children with courage as they faced this ruthless illness. The anesthesiologist approached him with a mask in hand. "Mr. Joseph, are you ready?" he asked, preparing to begin the procedure. Joseph nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. His body was worn out, but his heart continued to fight for each of his children. "Yes, I'm ready," he replied softly, his voice full of determination. "Let's save my children." The medical team moved with precision, preparing for the operation. Across the ocean, another team was getting ready to receive what Joseph was about to sacrifice for his children's lives. "Do you have any last words before we begin?" the anesthesiologist asked, already holding the mask. Joseph closed his eyes, his thoughts flickering like fragments of memories and wishes. He looked at Lillian, standing behind the glass window, her eyes full of anxiety and tenderness, which he could no longer see but felt with every fiber of his being. He knew her heart was beating in sync with his, sharing every minute of waiting, every second of tension. His gaze softened, and his voice, quiet but filled with emotion, broke the silence of the room. "Tell our children that I love them. Even though we didn't have the chance to truly know each other, I would do everything again to save them, no matter what happens." These words were filled with deep, unspoken love, the kind born in a heart ready to make any sacrifice for its children. The anesthesia began to slowly take over his consciousness, a heavy calm enveloping Joseph. The voices of the doctors became more distant, as if they were speaking from another world, a world that would soon disappear for him. His last vision was troubling: the face of a nurse, filled with care and concern, flickering before his closing eyes. Darkness wrapped around his mind, plunging him into an emptiness where there was neither pain nor fear. Meanwhile, the operation began, like a carefully choreographed dance, where every step carried immense weight. Scalpels and instruments moved with precision, each second stretching into hours, where time itself lost its meaning. The fate of Joseph and his children now rested in the hands of the surgeons. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the piercing sounds of heart monitors, as if death itself had cried out. Joseph's blood pressure was dropping rapidly, and one of the doctors shouted, "We need to stabilize him, or we'll lose him." The lead surgeon, though the tension was mounting, remained perfectly calm. "Not now, Joseph," he whispered through clenched teeth, as if speaking to the lifeless body. "Your children need you to keep fighting." The team worked feverishly, their movements fast and precise, like a frantic dance where life was on the line. On the other side of the glass partition, Lillian stood helplessly, her quiet prayers echoing through the empty hospital corridors. The hours stretched painfully, turning into an endless agony of waiting, filled with fear and hope. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the lead surgeon looked at his colleagues and said, "It's done. We have everything we need for both children." But the joy was short-lived. Suddenly, the anesthesiologist shouted, "He's going into shock." The words hit like a gunshot, shattering the stillness. The room exploded into frantic activity as the doctors desperately tried to bring Joseph back. Their hands moved swiftly and in perfect sync, while the monitors continued to scream alarms. Lillian, frozen by the window, pressed her hands to her face, her eyes wide with terror, but she couldn't look away. Everything happening before her felt like a nightmare from which there was no waking. The lead surgeon, still performing chest compressions, quietly muttered, "You've come this far, Joseph. Don't give up now." As if in response to his plea, the monitors finally began to show signs of life. A faint, barely audible but steady beep filled the room. Life, fragile as it was, returned to Joseph's body. The medical team exhaled in relief, but the work was not yet finished. Hours later, Joseph slowly opened his eyes. The bright light of the hospital room made him blink several times as he tried to gather his senses. Lillian was beside him, her face a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and relief. She gently squeezed his hand. "Welcome back," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, but a quiet joy was unmistakable in her tone. Joseph tried to speak, but his voice was raspy and weak. "The children." Lillian smiled through her tears, her lips quivering with relief. "They're fine, Joseph. You did it. You saved our children." Hours later, the air in the hospital corridor was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. Lillian, standing by Joseph's bed, tried to calm her nerves. She waited for Aya's adoptive mother, who was flying in on a different plane to see her daughter. The sound of hurried footsteps suddenly echoed down the empty hallway. Soon, a middle-aged woman appeared around the corner, her face swollen with tears, her hair disheveled. "Aya, where's my Aya?" Her voice trembled like a branch in the wind, full of worry and fear. Lillian stepped forward, extending her hand in a welcoming gesture. "Mrs. White? I'm Lillian, Aya's biological mother. And this is Joseph, her father." For a moment, a heavy silence hung between them. Mrs. White's gaze shifted between Lillian and Joseph, as if trying to comprehend what was happening. Finally, to everyone's surprise, she knelt beside Joseph's wheelchair, gently taking his hands in hers. "Mr. Joseph," her voice was choked with emotion, "I don't have the words to express what I feel." In that moment, as Mrs. White spoke, her voice trembled with emotion, but each word resonated deep within Joseph's soul. Her words were so sincere and filled with gratitude that it seemed as if time had slowed, leaving only the three of them, Joseph, Lillian, and her, in that quiet, emotion-filled hospital corridor. Courage, love, sacrifice, what you have shown, Mrs. White continued, is something I've never seen in my life. When I adopted Elia, I promised myself I would do everything in my power to protect her, to love her as my own child. But you, barely knowing her, as her biological father, risked everything for her life. You sacrificed your health, your safety to save her. It surpasses anything I could have imagined or hoped for. Her words enveloped Joseph in a wave of warmth, his heart filled with bittersweet joy and deep gratitude. He saw Mrs. White's trembling hands, her eyes brimming with tears, tears she could no longer hold back. I was desperate, she continued, looking at Joseph with deep respect. When the doctor said they couldn't find a compatible donor, I had no information about Elia's biological family, and that sense of hopelessness tore me apart. I lived with that despair, which felt unbearable. And then you appeared. You embarked on this dangerous journey, crossing oceans, facing medical risks, and confronting fear of the unknown, all for a little girl you had never even seen before. That shows such deep and unconditional paternal love that I'm simply lost for words. She paused for a moment, as if gathering her strength. Her gaze rested on Joseph, filled with gratitude that shone brightly in her eyes. I would have done the same for Elia if I could, she continued, squeezing his hand a little tighter. I know this was an incredibly difficult decision for you, to risk your life, leave everything behind, all for the chance to save not only Elia, but your son Aiden as well. This is generosity of the soul, endless love, to care so deeply for two children you barely had time to know. It's truly admirable. You didn't just save Elia's life, you've given me a lesson I will never forget. You've shown me that true love knows no boundaries. It doesn't falter in the face of danger, it does a retreat from hardship. Each of Mrs. White's words was filled with profound emotional power, resonating in the air of the hospital corridor like a wave washing over everyone present. When I think about those agonizing hours you spent on the plane, caring for Elia, even though your own health was on the verge, you were determined to move forward no matter the cost. That touches me deeply, Joseph. And then you underwent that risky surgery, ready to give a part of yourself to save your children. Such selflessness, such altruism, this is rare in our world. Mrs. White sighed heavily, as if each new phrase required more strength, but she kept speaking, her voice full of genuine respect and love. You didn't just give Ellie a life, she said. You gave her a future. You gave her an example of love and courage that will inspire her for the rest of her life. I know our situation is complicated, with so many emotions, so many intertwined lives and stories, but in this moment, I want you to know that I am endlessly grateful for everything you've done. You are not just Elia's biological father. You are her hero, a true hero. With those words, Mrs. White glanced at Lillian, who stood next to Joseph, her eyes also brimming with tears. The hospital corridor, once filled with tension and fear, was now awash with love and gratitude. Weeks after the surgery were an emotional storm, filled with hope, fears, and waiting. Each day felt longer than the last, and though Aiden and Elliot quickly recovered, gaining strength with each passing day, Joseph's condition remained precarious. His body, weakened by years and the risky surgery, seemed to have lost its ability to fight. Lillian and Mrs. White spent sleepless nights, taking turns watching over him, anxiously monitoring every change on the machines. One night, when things seemed especially bleak, Aiden approached his mother, his voice trembling with worry. "He's going to make it, right?" he asked, looking at Lillian with wide eyes. Lillian gently stroked his hair, trying to hide her own doubts behind a smile. "Your father is the strongest man I know," she whispered. "He won't give up, Aiden, not ever." These weren't just words, but a kind of vow she made to herself. That same night, as Lillian sat by Joseph's bedside, the doctor burst into the room, his eyes shining with new hope. He hurried to explain that they had found a chance. A new experimental treatment, combining cellular regeneration with nanotechnology, could not only heal Joseph's heart but reverse the damage done to his body. Joseph looked at the doctor, his face worn with pain, but a faint smile flickered in his eyes. "Doctor, I'm in your hands," he rasped. Lillian, unable to hold back tears of relief, squeezed Joseph's hand. Hope once again sparked in her eyes. "We'll make it," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. "We'll face this together as a family." The following days became an emotional roller coaster for everyone. The treatment was grueling and exhausting for Joseph. The session seemed to drain the last of his strength. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the first signs of improvement began to show. His complexion returned, his breathing became easier, and the spark of life once again appeared in his eyes. Elia, still recovering, insisted on seeing her father every day. Weak but determined, she would come to his bedside, holding his hand, and say, "Daddy, you have to get better. We have so much time ahead of us." Those words struck deep into Joseph's heart, giving him the strength to keep fighting. "I'll do everything I can, sweetheart," he whispered in return. "I'll do the impossible." While Joseph fought for his recovery, Mrs. White made a life-changing decision. After long talks with Lillian and nights of reflection, she realized that she could not separate Elia from her new family. "I'll move here," she said one day, her voice full of resolve. "Elia deserves to have everyone who loves her." Lillian, barely holding back tears, hugged Mrs. White. "You're already part of our family," she whispered. "You will always be Elia's mother. DNA doesn't matter. You loved her when I couldn't be there. And for that, I am more grateful than words can express." Mrs. White wiped away her tears, embracing Lillian in return. "And now Elia will have twice the love," she said quietly, smiling. Months passed, and with each day, Joseph's recovery became more apparent. The revolutionary therapy worked miracles. Not only was his heart healing, but his entire body seemed to be coming back to life. He began taking short walks down the hospital corridors. At first, Lillian supported him, then he was able to walk on his own. Finally, Aiden and Elia were at his side, each lovingly holding his hand. "Look at the three of you," Lillian said one day, watching them from a distance. "Who would have thought that the man who once hid behind the mask of a beggar would become Father of the Year?" Joseph smiled. The sound of his laughter, once rare, had become common. "Life really does have a way of surprising us," he replied, squeezing his children's hands. When the day of Joseph's discharge arrived, it was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of a new one. Gathered at the hospital entrance, the entire family, including Mrs. White, stood by his side. Joseph, standing without assistance, looked around at their faces, filled with joy and love. His heart overflowed with gratitude. "Where are we going now?" Aiden asked, his voice trembling with anticipation. Joseph smiled, pulling them all into a tight embrace. "Oh, my lads, we're all finally going home." And as they stepped out of the hospital toward a future that once seemed impossible, Joseph knew the path ahead was one they would walk together as a true family.